Okay, so love it that we have some people here, have some people online. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We are recording this, and I was reminded the other day, I am recording these. We do put them out on our YouTube site. I have not made them private just because it's more difficult for you to get in and find them in private. So in doing that, I was reminded that it's important to tell you that these sessions are for members of the Legends of Real Estate. Any discussions that we have during these conversations that we record are for our brokerage only. So the discussions that we have should be open and honest. If someone jumps onto one of these recordings, please know that these recordings have been designed for the Legends of Real Estate team members, and any discussion of compensation or cooperation is done within the brokerage. So just want to make sure everybody's clear on that. I'm going to go ahead and share the agreements just so we can kind of start talking about them. So the focus today the focus is the compensation agreements that just came out. Hopefully you received them. I sent them out, I think, or sent a notice out last Thursday or Friday, and then sent them out on Sunday. I don't know that we're going to go the whole time. The compensation agreements are fairly straightforward. However, there are some anomalies, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have discussions, make sure that we feel comfortable about when these would be used, how these would be used. I'm going to try and, again, if you are online and you have a question, best thing to do is shout out, because sometimes I can see it and sometimes I can't. And so I will try and keep an eye on it. But just in case I don't see you when you have a comment, please don't hesitate to say something. See something, say something, right? Okay, great. All right. So the first one that we're going to go over is the compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker. I just want to make sure that we're just going to have just open, honest discussion. It's us. So let's stop at any point and talk about whatever we need to do. As you probably have become acclimated, things will change August 17th a little bit as it relates to compensation, and compensation being pulled from MLS. In addition to compensation being pulled from MLS starting August 17, you will be required to have a buyer brokerage agreement for any buyer that you're working with prior to touring a property. So I know we've said this a few times. I think the more we hear it, the more we can adjust to it and acclimate to it. This does not include an open house. So there's no disclosure that you must provide at an open house. Is it good to ask? Are you currently working with another realtor? Yes, that's something we should have always asked at open houses. So there's a lot of good questions that stay in line with working with a customer, or when a customer comes to an open house. But prior to touring an open house, this would be prior to showing a home, we are required to have a buyer brokerage agreement. We've had a couple of sessions on the buyer brokerage agreement. We're going to have a couple of more. We're talking about usage, that kind of thing, prior to August 17th. But how does this relate to forms? So as with the agreement, NAR, with the settlement, there's going to be changes to our forms. Some of those forms are going to mean new forms. So these are the 4 new forms. It's really 2 forms, that's all, and 2 modification forms, 1 for each of the forms. What about all the other forms? Okay, well, all those other forms are being modified. Riders are being modified. Listing agreements are being modified. Purchase and sale agreements are being modified. Those will be released, one set on July 9th and another set on July 23rd. So items or forms will be released as they're modified and come out. They will be available in App Files immediately. App Files is currently working on any forms that have been released. The compensation agreement forms that we'll be working with today are currently available in App Files. You may have noticed in App Files, the forms packages. There are more forms packages now available to you. In addition, you'll find that the forms packages now include both NEFAR and Florida Realtor forms. I know that's confusing. I know there's a lot of forms in a package, and I know that it's going to be a little confusing where you If you start with the NEFAR form, you just want to use the NEFAR documents. But remember, as of this Sunday, the NEFAR forms will be sunset. So as of Monday morning, those NEFAR forms will be pulled from app files.
No longer used anywhere in the state.
No longer used anywhere in the state. So we're one of 3 boards that has done our own forms. So now there'll only be 2 boards, Naples or Pensacola and Naples, that do their own forms. So we'll all be on the Florida Realtor forms. And NEFAR will remain, is keeping a couple of forms. NEFAR is keeping currently the repair and replacement form and one other form.
Lockbox.
MLS. Excuse me?
Lockbox.
Thank you. Lockbox addendum. Lockbox addendum.
CDD addendum.
Thanks, Bonnie. The what?
The CDD addendum? They don't have one.
Yeah, Florida Realtors has one. You have to find it. I put it into the file.
Okay,
They
couldn't
do
find
have, they do
earlier.
have, I'm sorry.
I was
I'm
looking,
sorry?
I couldn't find one.
Yeah, it's not easy to find because of the sections. It's broken down into sections, and you have to go. It's down when you put in community or community development. It's all the way down at the bottom. It's under Florida or something like that. They do actually have one. I agree with you that it's probably better if NEFAR keeps the community development district one. I think it's a stronger form if they keep that one. And then MLS is keeping the waiver of entry. Now, if you've looked at the listing agreement, there's already a waiver of entry incorporated into the listing agreement, but Real MLS is keeping the waiver of entry because the waiver of entry developed by Real MLS requires the submission to Real MLS. We have a board meeting tomorrow. I don't know if that's going to stay or go. We'll see. But there will be a couple of forms from the MLS side and from the NEFAR side that stay, so those will still be available. For example, if you were to go into a forms package right now, into a purchase package, and there would be the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement and the as-is. Automatically on Monday, that NEFAR one will be pulled, and the as-is will be the only purchase and sale agreement in the purchase packages. So
Wow.
the packages are there. We're adding the forms. I know it's confusing. Just call if you have a question, and we'll work it out together.
I think it's just going to be like anything else.
Yeah.
Even the more you use it, the easier it will get.
Absolutely, and there's some really very positive things about both the listing agreement and the purchase and sale agreement. I mean, the listing agreement's 4 pages. I mean, it really takes out a lot of other stuff. Is that good or bad? So, like the personal property listing agreement is no longer in there. So, and I used to like that because they could set the expectation with the seller on what they planned on leaving. And then as we got into negotiation, if the seller felt like, oh, I'm being hit up one side and down the other, I'm not going to leave my stainless steel refrigerator, I'm just going to move the one from the garage. I could go back and say, okay, I get it. Let's see if we can put that aside. Remember when we first talked, we talked about leaving that stainless steel refrigerator. So why don't we go ahead and leave that and look at the other terms and conditions that make sense? So is there still a way to make that happen? Yeah, we're talking about other forms that we as a company may want to offer you. In addition to, as we get into compensation, these compensation agreements were developed to facilitate the memorializing of a commitment from a seller to compensate a buyer's brokerage. Right? One from the seller to the buyer's brokerage, and the other if the listing brokerage is negotiated with the seller to provide compensation, then to confirm or affirm that compensation. So what this means is with MLS pulling compensation, we are going to have to make some phone calls, right? And you know what happens in phone calls. I call Holly and I talk, and then I think we're on the same page, and then either we didn't communicate well or I didn't confirm. So these forms are there to facilitate those conversations. There could be other forms. Now, if you've read some of the stuff that's going on right now, there is a case that's been filed with the Florida Real Estate Commission, one brokerage to another, because a buyer's associate made an appointment for a list for a property and then canceled the appointment, and in the feedback section said the buyer has elected not to see this property because the seller is not offering compensation. Should the seller decide to offer compensation, please let us know. The listing brokerage has now filed with the Florida Real Estate Commission that that's an item of steering, that because the buyer should already have an agreement with the listing broker, the buyer's brokerage, excuse me, with the buyer's brokerage, there would be no reason not to show the property. So the agent is now steering, or the agent's brokerage is now steering the buyer away.
Can't say that.
I don't know where it'll go, but this is what this is what we're trying to help each of us understand, is that we have these tools. How do we use these tools? How do we protect our customer? How do we protect ourselves? And how do we make sure that everybody is on the same page? So communication is going to really, really be key. Yes, ma'am.
So I noticed in an update yesterday, a house on Inwood Terrace that came up, and in the comments, it said no commission. So is that, it
Wow.
says no commission.
Wow.
So
So-
that is going of what we're going to expect. Right?
Right. So then there would be a form that you can use to help establish compensation as part of the negotiation, as a request from the buyer. And that's one of these two forms here. However, I will tell you that comment in private remarks, I'm
Yes.
guessing, will be a violation after 16.
No
So will there, so there won't even be a box, like yes or no?
No.
No, ma'am.
Well,
change.
Yeah.
So the question was, will there be a box? Just to put everybody on notice. The Real MLS is elected to have no pre-closing concessions field. So there will be no concessions field available on an active or active under contract listing. Concessions field will only be available after the property is closed. Because the rationale being, if we have agreed that compensation is being pulled, and now we add a concessions field, everybody's just going to put into concessions field 3%, 4%, $5,000, $7,000.
See, that happened, that would be easy. So
So-
with this one that said no compensation, the seller is, in other words, the listing agent has his fee that he is charged the seller. But the seller is saying, I am not going to cooperate with any buyer. If you want to buy this property, then you will need to have your the buyer pay for the commission. Correct?
Or have
That-
your agent just roll over and be like, you would like this house. I don't know, it's very true.
Well, you can write it in the contract.
You could write it there and say, seller.
Consent, you can put a concession in the contract,
Oh.
correct?
Correct. So,
And
So-
that would be part of your offer.
Even though it says no commission.
okay, so
If they don't get
the discussion
whatever-
is opened up a little bit, guys. So if you do have something you want to add to what we're talking about. So if we're using Holly's example of the property on Inwood Terrace that has put into private remarks, no commission or no compensation, that comment or that listing will be identified, or that comment will be pulled, or that listing will be identified as having a violation. Here's also the scoop with that. Any compensation that shows up, or any reference to compensation, is an immediate $1,000 fine.
Even so, if you have a VA working for you or someone else, like, it's up to us to communicate to that person who's putting in our listing.
You ain't putting it in MLS, otherwise.
What was the question?
Right, so I'm sorry, Bonnie, go ahead.
What was the question she asked?
So Maggie had said, so if you're working with a virtual assistant or a transaction coordinator who's inputting the information for you, you need to make sure that they are aware of these rules. so that no information gets into MLS that shouldn't be there, because it is an immediate $1,000 fine. This is something that can't be taken away.
Mm.
So once it's in there, you can't take it away. In other words, you may be able to go and erase the words,
Right.
but the words are out there, so it can't be changed. So it is an immediate $1,000 fine. So,
I think-
and if it's not removed, then the fine then doubles.
And this payable by you, Clark, we appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Well, you know, isn't that funny that you would say that, Mike? Hey, Amy, can you grab a chair just from the office, please?
Yeah.
So and Mike was so kind to say that we would be paying that, and oh, well, the assumption would be nice. However, no, it goes past. That's why we're doing these.
Wow.
That hits
Wow.
our license, correct?
It hits
National?
your, excuse me?
Is it national?
No, this is real MLS's fine.
Oh, okay.
So, and remember, real MLS donates fines back to the nonprofit. So,
Yeah, well,
This is the seller's. Their own concession, we put no concession.
Yeah.
Right?
so the discussion, the thing that's opened up related to Inwood Terrace listing is there's no commission or no compensation identified in the private remarks. So the comments were, well, how do we manage that? That's what these compensation agreements are for, because the buyer can still request compensation directly from the seller as part of their offer. And what I will say is, when I checked with the legal hotline, even if you request compensation as part of your offer, for example, in seller costs or in the additional terms and conditions, you will still need to have one of these two forms completed and attached. So it is not sufficient just to write into
Okay,
the comments, or excuse me, into the seller costs or additional comments that the buyer is requesting 2.5%, 2%, $7,000 that the seller paid to the buyer's brokerage. You must have one of these other agreements. Part of the reason that it is because these agreements require the signatures of the parties engaged. So it's a secondary means of confirming or memorializing. Plus, these agreements set a timeline. And a comment in the offer does not set a timeline to the compensation.
Do we share this with the other agent?
These two compensation agreements are to be attached as if they were riders or addenda Yes.
to an offer.
to an
I
offer.
think that
Well,
makes it stronger.
yes, I think so. And the other part of it is that you'll see with one of the compensation agreements, you can actually fill it out with the seller at the time of listing.
Right, yeah.
And keep it and make copies of it so that you can then engage with other brokers. So,
Fill it out by hand and so like, let's do
Well-
this now, so we don't have to do it later and then.
sure, or fill it out, electronically and have them sign it, and then you'll have multiple copies. We'll be able to just fill in the information as you counter or as you work with, after you get that phone call from another agent saying, is the seller offering compensation? Yes, the seller's offering compensation. They're offering 1%. Okay, great, thanks. You can memorialize that or confirm that with one of these two agreements, or you can potentially take that information and then as part of your offer, use one of these two forms to, as an addendum or rider to your offer, requesting additional compensation or requesting compensation at a level
Okay.
that you have agreed to, or requesting compensation at a level that is appropriate for the agreement that you have with your buyer. Right?
Should we start
So
preparing,
remember,
should we
I'm
start,
sorry.
should we start preparing buyers that the seller is not going to offer compensation, but that will negotiate it as part of a closing cost?
Well, I think what we need to do is start preparing the buyers. I think what we need to do is start with the buyer agency agreement. Was that Jill?
Well, yeah, I always have to sign it anyway, I put
Yeah.
it in what I'm going to get anyway. But should we be
Right.
preparing buyers who are not maybe in the market yet, that, hey, this is a change that's coming and the compensation is no longer guaranteed. You might have to come up with an additional 2.5%, 3%, whatever your 4%, whatever your commission is for your buyer.
And I don't disagree with you. I think that's the perfect discussion to have around the buyer agency agreement.
Right.
So as part of your discussions, oops, I forgot to do this, sorry. So as part of your discussions with your buyer consultation, I think you're exactly right. I think part of what we need to do is be having that discussion of there's the opportunity or possibility that, you know, compensation will not be completely covered by the seller. So in signing that, now, you know, one of the things that comes up is first-time home buyers. Another thing that comes up is VA buyers. Please note that as of 2 weeks ago, a VA buyer is able to compensate, is able to pay compensation or compensation to a buyer's broker. Please also note that as of last August, actually, the VA buyer is permitted to pay the transaction fee. We have continued to waive it, but the VA buyer is allowed to pay the transaction fee. So all fees are now available for a VA buyer, good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know which is the way to look at it, but that's, you know, it's a change of the time. So back to Jill's question, should we be preparing potential buyers? Yes, but remember, after August 16th, we are required to have a buyer brokerage agreement with anybody that's committed to us. So I think that, you know, you've long set the standard for using a buyer agency agreement, Jill. So I think that that's where we all need to get to, is how do we use this buyer agency agreement to open up the discussion up? Because that's a hard line. And if we look at that case that's with the Florida Real Estate Commission right now, so what do we do to prepare ourselves? I mean, so if we say to a buyer, here's this agreement, you could be obligated to 2.5%. And please remember, this is a discussion that we're having as a group within the same brokerage. So if someone else hops onto this video from someplace else, please know that these conversations are for the Legends of Real Estate Realtors. So if you have a buyer agency agreement at 2% or 2.5%, what about a bonus that's being offered? What about, you know, remember with the new buyer agency agreement, we can only accept no more than what we've agreed to with the buyer. So if the buyer agency agreement, and we have that discussion with our buyers, you know, you could be obligated to compensate us for 2.5%. That's my fee. So we have to start with what's our value, what's our fee, this is what I pay, and here's the way that this agreement is created, is that we will go to the other party to offset some of this compensation if possible, but remember, we may not be able to. So back to Jill's point, do we have to have that discussion about you may be on the line for? Absolutely, we have to have the discussion you may be on the line for. The other part is that we have to find a more cohesive way, comprehensive way maybe, to present to our buyers the properties that they would like, that we are planning on, that they've requested showings on. We have to have transparency. So Mr. and Ms. Buyer, Ms. Buyer, here's the deal. Here's the properties you've elected to see as full transparency. Here's the compensation that's being offered. Here's what we've agreed to. Here's the difference. And they have to acknowledge that. If they then choose not to see one, we're going to have to find a way to make sure that it's memorialized in writing that they have made this decision.
So like if we schedule it in MLS and we set up the tour and then they say, oh no, like I don't actually want to go see that one. If we don't take them to that property, we'll have to find a way to make sure that we can document
That's what
in case they go behind our back, right?
or just that they say that I really wanted that house and she wouldn't show it to me.
And that's exactly the case that's going
So
for the
then
Florida
how
Real
do-
Estate Commission.
We need a form. We
the-
need a form for that.
yeah, well, I'm working on it because Florida isn't.
Well,
So we're trying to find something that will assist you. I'm sorry, Bonnie?
no, I got a better way to approach
Oh,
it,
Jill.
would to tell every buyer, assume that there's no seller compensation being offered.
Yeah.
And we will
yeah.
negotiate that as part, if you like it, we'll negotiate that as part of
Yeah.
the contract.
Yeah.
I think that's perfect script for your buyer agency agreement. Yeah,
You'd rather have the worst scenario
right.
than to promise something that you cannot fulfill.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think going back to the original question of how do we discuss this compensation piece? And I've gone on 2 listing appointments in the past 2 weeks. One lady has already talked to another realtor who's willing to sell the place for 2.5%.
with no compensation to buyer brokerage.
That's it. Look at my cost. I'm able to do this just for 2.5%. And the question that I asked her is, I said, do you understand what you're getting in return for just the 2.5%? I said, this is all negotiable. But she didn't understand that if I bring a buyer, she had no idea that they weren't getting paid anymore. So to me, it's an education on whether it's a listing or on you're on the buyer side, to where we have to separate ourselves from our agencies on what others are doing, what I call just a land grab on these listings. Oh, we'll do it just for 2%. We'll do it for 1.5%. But they're not telling these people what they're expecting on the back end when it comes down to an offer coming in. That's what I found on 2 of mine.
Well, and I think that
This
Inwood,
one right here that we just saw.
so the Inwood Terrace one is a perfect example. What's gonna end up happening is,
No, it's terrible though, because I talked to Cece at Keller Williams, and for Cece Cummings, is that her last name? I'm not sure. But okay, so I had an off-market pocket listing on Waterman for the Inwood buyers. I was gonna do the seller side and hopefully pull them in. They said, oh no, you gotta talk to our agent Cece. We only go through her. And to see that they listed that themselves, because that's for sale by owner, this listing, her name is not on there anywhere.
On Inwood Terrace.
Yeah.
Inwood Terrace is for
Flat-
sale
flat
by owner.
fee. It's a
Oh.
flat fee.
Oh, well, so it's not a for sale by owner.
And they did not, well, okay.
It's listed by a brokerage, otherwise it couldn't be in MLS. So they're a brokerage, but keep going, I'm sorry.
Oh, no,
I
it's
just want to make
fine.
sure
You're
that
right. That's
clarification.
good difference. If it's on MLS, it's not,
That's
I
what we're
thought that
doing.
you could be for sale by owner and then pay like $500 to have a listing company do your marketing.
But it's still listed.
Yeah, but it's still a brokerage.
Yeah, okay.
So flat fee is still a brokerage. They're a member of the MLS. So I think it's a great point, because we're probably going to see a lot more of this. These flat fee brokerages start to flourish a little bit as sellers go, well, how much is it going to cost me? To what Mike and Maggie are saying is that, oh, it's going to cost you just what we charge you. It's just going to be, $500, 2.5%, $1,000, and we'll put it into MLS. Well, but they're not getting anything else. In Mike's case, at 2.5%, they may be getting, marketing, advertising, development, all the value that agent would bring to a listing, but they're not getting the value that a buyer's brokerage is going to be bringing in. And then did flat fee on the Inwood Terrace property educate the seller in the fact that there's probably going to be a negotiation that comes up at the time of offer related to buyer brokerage compensation. And obviously the interviewee did not, or the interviewee, the realtor didn't disclose how the process would work.
So let me ask you this, do we have something in place? I'm sure you're working on a form.
I'm working on
When-
policies.
When my buyer says, Mike, I'm not paying any fees whatsoever, don't
Right.
show me anything under, if they're not at least bringing 2%, I don't want to see it.
Right,
Do we have a form, though they said that,
Just say
to
that.
cover ourselves, because that has already happened. I can see things coming to fruition.
yeah,
How do we protect ourselves in that? Because if it comes back and says, hey, I don't want to see this because I want to be out of pocket,
mhm.
how do we cover ourselves?
Yeah.
We got
So, yes,
An
we will.
email.
We will.
Okay.
As of August
16.
16th, we'll have a form. So, the goal is our policies, I've rewritten the policies probably 4 times, but haven't released them only because things keep changing. So I'd like to have them comprehensive and not have you to keep going through changes. I'd rather focus on the forms and the processes right now and then get the policies out before the August 17th date, as well as any additional forms that we as a brokerage feel are necessary to ensure that your customer, you, and the brokerage are protected.
It's gonna be a
That's gonna be
mess
sticky.
for a while.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I think you're right. I think it's going to be a little icky for a little while.
I think
Right.
the first 6 months, it's gonna be, everybody's gonna feel out for the first 6 months. Is this going to go the way? Are we gonna kind of do the standard? Are we not? Who's gonna press? And I do think you're gonna see things come to finalize.
And the settlement's still not settled.
No,
So
Yeah.
that could change
Bless it,
things
yeah.
as well.
A year from now, it'll be easy peasy.
Nah.
He says a year from now will be easy peasy. So it's just
Keep
acclimation.
reminding us of that. would
Good
you
thing this
please?
is recorded.
But yeah, good thing that's recorded. We have to have to remind ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So thank you guys. That's great conversation. I appreciate that. That's why we're doing these, so that we can all start to get our footing on where we're going. But yeah, I think Jill's point about, the conversations we have at the buyer agency agreement, what we're saying here about those flat fee people, making sure that our buyers are educated, making sure that those that we're interviewing with for listings are educated on the change in processes, I think maybe is the way that it works, awareness. Now, remember the listing agreement, to the point of the seller who may not have been as well informed, they are going to have to go through the listing agreement. The listing agreement will break out now. This is the fee that we charge as a brokerage to list your property.
Right.
Let's go to the next, and I don't know if it'll be a paragraph or a subparagraph or however the legal minds work. My mind's too simple. I figure one paragraph tells you what we're charging, and the next paragraph tells you what you have the option to do with a buyer. But I don't know what it's going to look like. So, and then we'll know that hopefully by, I think that one's supposed to be out. I don't think that one's actually coming till July 23rd.
Yeah.
But the buyer agency agreement is coming out on July 9th. So the Tuesday after that, we'll be discussing that agreement. So look for an online and an opportunity to hang out again on that day too, if
So
not
this-
before.
This will go to our contract when we get an offer, when the seller gets an offer. They will send a copy of this back to the buyer's brokerage as part of the contract.
So yeah, so Holly's question is, so the compensation agreements will be included with the offers. The compensation agreements have been placed into all packages, both listing and sales packages, because they can be initiated by the seller or by the buyer's brokerage or by the buyer. So the two compensation agreements, not the modifications, are in every single package currently.
Okay.
And that's because they can be used in different ways. So let's jump into this. Let's jump into the first one. We're going to start with the seller agreement, seller to buyer's brokerage. Again, they were in, they have put them into the chat, I think. If you didn't see them, I hope they're in the chat somewhere. Yeah, there they are. Okay. And you should be able to download them, or it was attached to the email from Sunday. So notice the parties here are the buyer's broker and the seller. So this agreement is going from the seller to the buyer's broker. So in a case like this, if you are an agent working with a buyer and Inwood Terrace, no compensation, you would attach this to your offer. If you're working with a for sale by owner, you would attach this to your offer. Now, please remember that if you choose to write a comment into the purchase and sale agreement, then you would also attach this agreement because it is more detailed. It talks about what happens if there's a dispute, and it has a deadline. Okay. This could also be initiated by the seller to confirm, affirm, or negotiate compensation that has been requested by a buyer. So remember, the goal of the settlement is to decouple and to allow negotiation to occur between buyer. If it comes through the buyer's brokerage as part of the offer, it is actually being initiated by the buyer themselves. We identify the property for fairly straightforward. We identify the property. And then there's an actual term. This is one of the reasons that if you write a statement into the offer where the buyer is requesting the seller to compensate the buyer's broker, this form should also be attached and referenced. So this compensation agreement takes effect when a fully executed copy has been delivered to all parties to this agreement and will remain in effect for. So we need to fill in this blank.
265.
I was gonna say,
Eternity.
is there a reason why we selected 30 and not 60 days?
Okay, so and I see where you're going, both of you are going on this.
Yeah.
The term really is for the negotiation period. So this is why they've selected 30, because I'm submitting this with my offer, and then maybe I have a negotiation back, or maybe we go, I'm glad they didn't select 15, but I think 30 may be a little long. But remember, this is the term that you have to get something under contract, because the next line states, or sorry, not the next line, one of the following lines states that it will be in effect once you're under contract. So in no event shall the term extend past the termination date of a seller's broker current listing of the property, including any extensions. So what this is saying is, and I checked with the legal hotline, if I use this as a for sale by owner, do I have to cross out this line because a for sale by owner wouldn't have a brokerage agreement, right? A listing brokerage agreement. But what they've said is, if it isn't applicable, then there's no reason to cross it through, right?
Okay.
So I can use this with a for sale by owner to memorialize or confirm the compensation that's being paid from the seller directly to the buyer's brokerage. And I wouldn't have to cross out that line.
That's what we use those one-time showing compensation agreements for those FISBOs for.
The other form that Florida Realtors does have, other than the one-time showing that NIFAR had, is a commission agreement. So if it is a for sale by owner, your commission agreement would also be applicable. So it would be an addendum that you would use. So Florida Realtor forms, you can use this compensation agreement, seller to buyer's brokerage, or you can use the commission agreement
Or something.
for sale by owner.
So
Correct.
do we want to put 30 days in here? What do we want it to, or do we want to accelerate that time? Just do 15 days.
I would say anticipate what kind of a situation you're in. If you want this to, I mean, I can see all sorts of, if Holly and I are negotiating, or Amy and I are negotiating, it may not be an extended period of time. I may submit the offer, she may counter, and then I may counter, and within a week we've got it tied up and locked up and we're good to go. However, we all know that there are situations when we submit an offer, and remember, the new agreement allows 48 hours, 2 days. The new purchase and sale agreement, 2 days for counter offers. And that's a hard line.
Good.
There's no blank. It's 2 days.
That's it. And you can't cross it out.
You can't cross it out. So
And no
I have,
extensions?
when I submit my offer to you, no matter what I say to you, well, I'm sorry, my initial offer has a deadline on the purchase and sale agreement. But your counter has a 2-day window for me to go, and then finally respond to you. But and that's why it's 30 days. Because let's say that we now negotiate and we can't come to an agreement. But 2 weeks later, the buyer that I'm working with changes his mind and wants to go back. Well, then this compensation agreement is still in effect. So, I mean, it's going to be situational.
Okay.
I don't think, and Teresa was asking, should we crunch down the time from 30 days? Well, it's really going to depend on where you are and how that negotiation is going to go. I would not go any less than 15. I would not recommend any less than 15. Because of the 2-day window for counter offers that's written into the purchase and sale agreement, the as-is purchase and sale agreement, I would not recommend going less than 15. Anybody online want to have a comment?
I'd be tempted to raise it, actually.
From 30, just to protect yourself?
Right, I mean, if you have that buyer that wants to see X amount of, how many buyers have we had that make 6 offers on the property? And then they end up going back to that first one,
Right.
and things like
Okay.
that.
I think maybe that would be more appropriate for the buyer agency agreement.
Okay,
This focuses on the compensation that the seller will pay to the buyer's brokerage for this buyer, for this one buy, well, sorry, the seller for this property, on this one property.
but this goes with the offer with our buyer, though.
Right, but compensation wise, you will have locked, I don't like the word locked up. We have created an agreement with the buyer that's going to have an extended period of time longer than 30 days. This is solely for how the compensation will work from the seller to the buyer's brokerage on this one property.
Yeah. It's
So this
not
is very
for
property-
one- It's not for the buyer. Not
Total.
for the buyer, it's just for that property that they're making.
No, I'm thinking about that offer they made the property on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I see what you're
Okay.
saying, it's like if you show them 5 houses, right, in one day, and maybe they like, okay, I'm gonna do an offer on this one, but this is my second one, and I want you to write that up too, then we'd have to do this for every property that they're putting an offer in on. But to
It is
protect
property
ourselves up
specific.
front,
the buyer-
You can't
it's
just
just,
do it.
yeah.
can't do what, Bonnie?
No, nothing, go.
Oh, okay, all right. So, I mean, and maybe that works. I'm trying to figure out. So we're gonna have to see how the buyer brokerage agreement, the buyer brokerage agreement is gonna take precedence. So if we've established a 6-month or 1-year agreement with the buyer, they have an obligation to compensate the buyer, their brokerage, us, for that period of time. That overrides whatever we put into a seller to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement, which is between the seller and the brokerage for that specific property. Excuse me, the seller to buyer's brokerage agreement is not specific to an individual, it's specific to a property. It's also, remember, it's the seller to the buyer's brokerage. So once the seller commits on that property to pay our brokerage, whether it be agent A or agent B that shows that, they have a commitment to pay the buyer brokerage. Here's the challenge. Agent A and agent B aren't going to know what agreement has already been made. So each party is still committing the brokerage to compensation based on the negotiation that they're
Oh, ah,
making. So if,
well, that,
let's go back to Inwood Terrace. If Teresa was interested in Inwood Terrace and Mike was if Teresa and Mike had customers interested in Inwood Terrace, Teresa creates a seller to buyer brokerage agreement because, of course, Inwood Terrace is currently not offering any compensation. So as part of Teresa's offer, she makes an agreement to Inwood Terrace to say, we're requesting 2%.
Yeah.
Now, Mike makes an offer on Inwood Terrace and his agreement is 2.5%. But Teresa and Mike don't know that they're both at buyers interested.
oh, man,
But
that
now,
takes away an even playing field.
but now the seller has multiple offers, potentially multiple offers from the same brokerage, offering a varied compensation.
Dang.
How about, and we're not allowed to charge the agents, or sorry, agents are not permitted to charge the buyers upfront a flat fee to open doors for X amount of time.
No,
Yeah,
the retainer that's currently in the NEFAR agreement, I don't believe will be available in the new buyer agency. I know. No, I know. We've got some agents that I'm proud of agents that are saying there's a retainer fee. Everybody online okay?
So is this like, is this settled or that scenario you just said, that does take even playing field, you know?
Well, the NAR settlement has stated that we all must have a buyer brokerage agreement. Could the state of Minneapolis, could the state of Minnesota have a different buyer agency agreement than the state of Florida? As long as both buyer agency agreements abide by the guidelines of the settlement.
Yeah.
Could they be worded differently? Yes. Could they be longer, shorter? Yes. But what we have to work with is the state of Florida's buyer agency agreement, which again should be out July 9th. And that will tell us, I believe that retainers will be removed. But that will tell us, of course, a couple of different things that we aren't currently using is that we can no longer accept more than what is agreed to with the buyer.
So the buy bonus.
Okay, well, I don't know. I mean, if you look through this, when we get down to the buyer, if you just jump down to paragraph 4 on buyer brokerage compensation, it's check one of the below, and the second checkbox says a percentage of the gross purchase price plus an amount.
Oh, like $1,000 if you find something in 30 days
Potentially, yes.
or whatever.
But
New
you would,
construction.
but that would have to be a discussion that you have with the listing brokerage. That the listing agent then says, yes, Maggie, we are willing to compensate at 2.5% plus $1,000 bonus. Now remember, if you've already gotten a buyer agency agreement executed, which you would have had to in order to show that property, your buyer agency agreement may only be 2.5%. You would now either have to amend the buyer agency agreement, or we'll have to find out if this would take precedence over that. I doubt that it would, because you already have a contract with your buyer. So your buyer agency agreement would have to state a percentage, and in additional comments, it would have to state bonuses up to a certain amount at the onset of your agreement with the buyer. However, what's being recommended by legal is that any overage, any differential or bonus should be directed back to the buyer.
Oh.
And then would you put that
Yeah,
right in
so-
the contract?
We can't charge our customers $1,000 for doing what we said we were gonna do in shorter amount of time than expected.
You mean, well, Bonnie, I heard you 1 second. Maggie, say that again, please, so I can think about what you're trying to say.
Okay,
Say it louder too, so that people online can hear you, please.
so I don't even know if I remember. I feel so turned
So,
around.
so, okay, what I heard was, so if I'm doing a good job for the buyer,
My client, the buyer,
I can't charge them more. I can't charge them an additional fee. No, unless you've established that at the onset.
which would be put in this.
No, which we put into the,
Okay.
we
Not
put
the-
into the buyer agency agreement. Right, right. So there's still new construction offering bonuses.
Right.
So in addition to Jill's point at the onset of the discussion, you know, that you're gonna, here's the deal, you're signing this, the expectation is you're gonna pay it. Let's go in knowing that. So now let's go in having that discussion about a bonus. If a bonus is offered, how do you feel about that, Mr. Ms. Buyer?
Hmm.
Could they then feel differently when they're making the offer? Sure. Right?
So Clark, let me ask you a question. Now that I'm seeing this in a different picture. So let's say that I decide I want 3% for my commission. I put that on my.
I'm sorry. Let's stop right there. I want 3% for my commission with
Buyer.
the buyer.
agreement.
Okay. All right.
Buyer agreement.
All right.
I now have a house. We are now negotiating it.
Okay.
I am now speaking with the listing agent. And she says, hey, my people are only willing to do 2%.
Okay.
There is a 1% difference there. You know what? Okay, I found the house in 15 days. I really didn't work that hard. I now want to change my percentage so that my buyer can now purchase the house, and I'm willing to knock off 0.5%, but yet he's now willing to come up to 2.5% instead of the 3%.
Mm-hmm.
To make the deal more negotiating as I see this. Then do I have to go back and edit my original buyer's agreement?
Right.
Or change it on this? How does this work now? Because if we're getting into a negotiation, I can see this, talking to Maggie's point, it's always easier for me to come down than to go up. Best way to approach that, Clark?
So yes,
You have a form coming.
probably. Anyway, I mean, we'll have some forms that you're right, we're gonna have some forms that we're gonna try and have ready by the 17th. I'm sure there will be other forms that as we move forward, we go, we need to protect everybody. How do we do that for everybody's best interest? So, but to your question, you would need to amend, Teresa said it was both. You would need to amend your buyer agency agreement.
Right.
And if you've created a seller to buyer brokerage agreement,
At 3%.
yeah, at 3%, then you would have to amend that. And what would end up happening is the seller would then use so we get the words right. They would use the modification to the compensation agreement to modify your compensation.
Wait a minute, the seller would? How
Sure.
come? Because if it's only on my brokerage agreement and I haven't yet.
No. This.
Oh,
Sorry.
that one,
This.
that compensation.
So
Okay,
there are two.
you are correct.
So there are two forms. And Bonnie, I'm sorry, I skipped over. You had a comment. I wanted to make sure that we got back to it, but let me finish this. So in Mike's situation, he would have executed a buyer's agency agreement at the onset of the relationship. That buyer agency agreement would have said 3%. During the negotiation, Mike is willing to drop his commission down from 3%. What does he have to do? He has to amend that buyer agency agreement. Second, when he made the offer, he would have submitted one of two forms. We're going to go with the seller to buyer brokerage agreement, compensation agreement. He would have submitted that at 3%. The seller, if in your situation, the seller said he's only willing to pay, the seller would have used the modification to modify what you have requested and modify to what he or she is willing to pay. And then you would now then decide with your buyer what is appropriate for the transaction, along with policies. Now, I will say to you, one of the policies in what I am currently working with in policy as it relates to buyer's agency agreement is a fee of 3% across the board. And then we'll in our policies, we will identify options and how that impacts you and us. But our recommendation is going to be to create
Stick
buyer
with that.
agency agreements at 3%. Because you can go down, you can't go up.
I agree.
And remember, our current policy is, because it's notified in MLS, is that we accept what is being offered, right? We accept currently what is being offered. Well, that doesn't exist anymore, so we have to establish guidelines for our brokerage. And that's why you hear in many of these classes, you need to go back to your brokerage. You need to go back to your brokerage because compensation has to be elected or identified within the brokerage. Now, Bonnie, if you even remember, if you even remember,
I
do you remember
already
your
figured it out. No, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Is anybody else online that I missed a comment or input that they want to make sure they have?
Well, I have a question, because
Yeah.
to me, this is us sticking our toe into the purchase and sale contract, when really we should have the sale contract be between just the seller and the buyer. So why wouldn't the buyer brokerage compensation agreement that we have with our buyer, why couldn't that just be applied as a closing cost rather than having this folderol and fiddle-de-dee form?
As long as the buyer is paying the full amount, the buyer brokerage agreement, which would not be shared with a seller, nor would it be shared with a title company, you on the commission disbursement, you would identify what the compensation is to the buyer's brokerage. So absolutely, but remember the current buyer brokerage, and I would imagine the buyer brokerage agreement coming up is going to identify that the brokerage, the buyer's brokerage, will attempt to get compensation or will credit any compensation being offered by the seller. And I don't think that any of this negates or changes the agreement, the purchase and sale agreement is between the buyer and the seller. Even Joanna Watkins was saying that we're not a party to the contract. So it's not that we're a party to the contract, it's that these agreements or these compensation agreements are to be done between the buyer and the seller through the buyer's brokerage, because the buyer has an agreement with the buyer's brokerage to compensate and is attempting to offset that compensation.
But aren't we attaching this as an addendum, right?
Yeah, because MLS had that in there.
That was very-
Once, did that make any sense at all?
It took,
Like,
yes,
Yeah.
yes, but in,
Okay,
but
wait,
in
but
four
Jill had a
words,
follow-up.
MLS used to have it.
Exactly.
And
Yeah,
the title company could just look on the MLS
Mm.
and they could just see all the information. Now we have to give them that information.
we have to give them the information. So I'm sorry, Jill, you had a follow-up comment?
Sorry.
Well, in the past, if we've had, if there's been a differential, I've just submitted a copy of my buyer broker agreement, which states that we've got an agreement with the buyer to pay a certain percentage. For example, if I'm selling a home that is listed by, $99 MLS person, and I submit my thing, they calculate the difference at title. And so it's more of a closing cost issue. And so why are we making this a compensation between the seller and the buyer's broker when this could be part of the listing agreement and we could just submit our listing agreements and buyer broker agreements? I'm kind of confused
we're
about
never-
what the thinking is behind this.
The thinking behind this is that the seller has to be the one providing or agreeing to the compensation to the buyer's brokerage. So the buyer has to initiate the conversation and the seller has to agree to it.
Yeah.
So the seller has to agree to compensate a buyer's brokerage. A seller has every right to say no, and then your buyer's brokerage agreement supersedes that, and the compensation would be coming. We shouldn't be submitting our buyer brokerage agreements or our listing agreements to title companies. They should go, that's why most title companies are going to have that email that they send or a document or a form that they send that we fill out about what the pieces are.
Yeah.
And just like the commission disbursement agreement goes back to the title company. So a differential would be identified on that. So we have to amend the commission disbursement agreement. But the reason that these forms exist between the seller and the buyer's brokerage is that the sellers in the case were stating that they had no idea that a portion of their funds that they were paying to the listing brokerage was going to a buyer's brokerage. They felt that that was unfair and that they had no opportunity to negotiate that. So this compensation agreement, this first one that we were going over, is to give the seller the opportunity to express their desire as it relates to compensation to the buyer's brokerage. So that's why we're sticking our hands in it, is because
Say for instance, for Inwood, right? Holly's a great agent. She sees no compensation. She knows her buyers are maybe a little finicky, or I don't know, we'll just say for instance. So there's no way that she can, well, let me ask, so knowing that there's no compensation offered and knowing that her finicky buyers have already said, we're not gonna pay you. If you, like, we just want you to find us a house, right? Are we allowed to factor that into the sale price? And then get it back as a concession at closing?
okay, so that has already come up also. Can we increase the price of the property to have the seller then pay the compensation to the buyer's brokerage?
And then we give the consumer, our buyer, the option, you could either pay this out of pocket or you can.
Finance and work.
Which is basically what's been happening all along.
Right.
Oh, I thought I was just making.
Well, no, I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
Think about it. The buyer has been, I'm sorry?
Everybody's muted.
Okay.
That's fine.
So, the way it's always been is that there's been compensation that's offered by the seller to the buyer's brokerage through the listing brokerage. through this brouhaha, the sellers are saying, we didn't realize that there was an amount being paid to a buyer's brokerage. And because we didn't realize that, we didn't have an opportunity to negotiate it. We want to negotiate what we pay to the buyer's brokerage, because the listing brokerages are asking for an amount larger than they should be. And what that's forcing us sellers to do is up the price. So in your example, could we, if the buyer is refusing to pay compensation to the buyer's brokerage, which would mean that your buyer brokerage agreement would have to have been at 0, then you want the seller to pay that, you submit an offer, a market value offer along with a compensation agreement, and the seller says, no, I'm not going to pay that at that price. And now you up the price to cover the compensation. And now we get into the same situation of, will the property appraise? Who's paying the differential? If the property doesn't appraise, how does this affect negotiation? And now we're doing the exact opposite of what the settlement was, a premise of the settlement, which is by now separating out what the buyer and the seller pay. In other words, who pays whom, or whom pays whom, or who pays whatever. By the buyer paying for the buyer and the seller paying for the seller, the decoupling, this should bring prices down. I don't believe it will. But if we then are folding in the compensation or increasing the price of the property, will the properties appraise? Appraisers have said, we do not look at compensation.
Because it's not.
Yeah.
No.
We don't base our market value on compensation.
No.
And then.
The only thing we do base it on is potentially concessions. I'm sorry. Right?
And then the as-is contract doesn't give us an out for an appraisal.
Not unless you've
So you
included the
have to-
appraisal contingency, or if it's FHA or V.
Good point.
Okay, understood.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I just, everything I've learned is being just
Don't have to work.
upside down.
Well, the thing is, if you increase the sale price, lo and behold, are you aware now that your property taxes are gonna be based upon the sale price of your
Oh,
home
good
instead of
point there, too.
$15,000? So
Right.
now you're gonna get tacked on that. To me, I can see a lawsuit coming right back saying, hey, there's $15,000 that was tacked on. You never disclosed to me that my property taxes are based on that and going up.
Good point.
Ouch. Good
Good
point.
job.
I'm out of here, I'm gone.
Right?
So,
So you can do a flat fee, you can do, the only other option is here is a percentage of the gross sales price of the property plus, and it has the blank for a bonus. So you could put 0 or you put to be determined.
you can't put, I wouldn't put to be determined, because remember, this is the seller to the buyer's brokerage.
Yeah.
So the seller has to commit to whatever. So if you've called me about a property that I have listed and I say, yes, Holly, by the way, the seller's offering 2% plus a $3,000 bonus. Well, then you would want to make sure that you include that $3,000 bonus in this seller to buyer brokerage compensation. But remember, you're going to have to amend your buyer brokerage agreement,
Because.
Yeah.
unless you put a,
And you wouldn't know that at that time.
well, no, unless you start your buyer brokerage agreement with 3% plus up to $5,000 bonus.
So this is where we
Good
get
idea.
to go back to maybe our sellers who we haven't listed with yet or something, and be like, hey, there's some changes, I wanna go over them with you. Now you can choose how much you want to compensate a buyer's brokerage. And these are your options. It could be a flat fee, it could be a percentage, or it could be nothing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's going to be, I mean, right now that's already in the listing agreement,
Yeah.
but it's going to be more blatant in the listing agreement as to what fees. So at the onset of a seller's consultation, we need to talk about value. We need to talk about what we charge. We need to talk about what we do for what we charge. And then we need to talk about how do we want to deal with the buyer? And that's the next
I think
piece.
the perception really comes down into the people that I've talked about, they're all aware that there was a huge lawsuit.
Mhm.
Now they understand that, wow, we're negotiating. The problem is it hasn't been settled. We are determining what we're doing as a brokerage in this office. There's how many other people that are having similar discussions, approaching this from a different way. So I think what you're going to see is the first 6 to 9 months, you're going to see a big wave. What's going to become the standard? Is the standard going to change? Are people really wanting to pay the full amount? Are they not going to? And I think the other thing is I'm hoping we will get rid of a lot of real estate agents that don't want to talk or refuse to pick up the phone when I call them and asking them specific details about a specific property. That's my goal.
Well, so let me just add to that. So there should never be a standard. There can only be a standard within a brokerage. It's another part of what this whole settlement was related to. You guys keep saying that's, it's not approved, it's not approved. It has been preliminary approved, preliminarily approved.
Yeah.
They have to give their final blessing in November, but I don't see much changing for us or for them as it relates to the settlement. So I mean, we have to figure out our path. I don't disagree. That there are thousands of discussions going on. My scary point is those discussions that aren't going. There are brokerages of 500, 600, 700 agents that there are no discussions going. I've had people call me from brokerages that I find are very reputable brokerages that say they have not talked to us about anything. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what to tell you. I can only tell you what we're trying to do. So it is all over. It's across the board. But the good thing is if we can keep you engaged, if we can keep you aware, if we can keep you thoughtful, and if we can help set standards that we feel are good for your customer, for the brokerage, for yourselves, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. So anyway. So this is the compensation part. So I did want to mention that, I'm sorry, anybody online want to have anything to say before we move on?
Clark, back up
Yeah.
1 second to the initials down on the bottom. The seller and the broker.
The initials,
Are we gonna email this to
Yeah.
you? Is that what we're gonna do? How's that gonna work?
no, it can be, you can email it to me, yes.
I mean, we're not gonna sign it. We're gonna have to send it to you, right? Am I
I
correct?
believe, I thought it said somewhere in here about buyer's broker or authorized, here we go, buyer's broker or authorized associate. So you can actually
So we can.
initial
Okay.
it on our
Okay.
behalf.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes, you can.
That would be
Yeah, yeah.
Monday. Okay. All right.
So yeah, there is a term. Hopefully we'll get an idea on the term. We'll make a recommendation on the term of no less than. I think 30 days, potentially longer, depending on where you feel that this property is going to be in your buyer's choices. We talked a little bit about the buyer brokerage compensation. The seller is agreeing to either a flat fee, a percentage, or if there's another way that they want to manage this. Notice over here, there is an opportunity for a plus dollar amount, but remember, we're not allowed to, once we have the establishment of the buyer brokerage agreement, we're not allowed to receive any more than was established in the buyer brokerage agreement.
Unless it's amended.
Unless it's amended, thank you. Yep, you can amend the buyer brokerage agreement.
What could other terms be?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I wasn't expecting that. Expecting it.
Yeah, if anybody has any idea what other terms, yeah.
When you
or
find out, let us
maybe
know.
stock in addition to that. I honestly don't know.
Yeah, it is.
But isn't it interesting that they're saying in here that any of these forms cannot be put on.
Correct. Thank you very much. I wanted to make sure.
You would think that you would know why we're going through this, that we can't do it.
Again, there are other brokers that aren't even talking to their agents. But now we just have to hope that they'll read that. So yeah, to Ollie's point, please note at the bottom of all these, it does say that these forms are not to be placed into MLS. So just because the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer's brokerage and they fill one out, that doesn't mean that they have, that you can put it in MLS. The very top, I just want to make sure that doesn't get missed. The seller acknowledges that compensation paid to the buyer's broker is for services the buyer's broker provided to the buyer. Again, this is back to the seller not being aware that some of the compensation that they were paying to the listing brokerage is going to the buyer's broker. So that's where that comment comes from. Go ahead.
No, I just find that that was a part of the listing agreement term, and it was in there, and it was discussed. So they keep saying it wasn't, but it was.
Right.
It's always discussed.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you.
How did they win? I don't get that. Jeez.
Emotion. Dispute resolution. So this is one of the other reasons that Florida Realtors has stated why, even if you write something into an offer about the seller compensating the buyer's brokerage, you would still need this agreement. And it's because all controversies and claims and other matters in question between the parties arising out of or relating to this agreement or the breach thereof will be settled by first attempting mediation. Just as a reminder, mediation as of 2000 was required to be offered by all boards. We do have mediation available through our board. It is at a reduced, very reduced cost. It's very inexpensive, or actually might even be free through the board, which is a good thing. So you can go to mediation. If agreement can't be reached, you would be going to arbitration. Arbitration would require the initialing of the seller and the broker's associate here, broker or a representative of the brokerage here, if the if the seller is indicating that they're open to arbitration if they can't come to an agreement based on mediation. Any miscellaneous clauses, it's constructed under Florida law, electronic signature is okay. Brokers' commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. You'll see that a lot throughout these. It's assigned
But
by
in arbitration, we do, these are,
We
these
get them to
initials are
sign.
required,
They're required or not?
yeah.
it is not required that the seller and the brokerage agree to arbitration.
So we leave these blank if,
Let them, they decide.
Let the seller decide
All right.
if the seller is open to arbitration. Arbitration would be the resolve if mediation doesn't work.
so we
So-
encourage them to do that, or just let them decide, I understand that point, but if they do have to be filled out,
They
No,
they
they
do
don't.
not have to be initial.
they do not have to be initial.
They do not have to be initial. It would be the option of the seller to initial that. So what does that mean? Remember, there's a modification to this agreement. So if by chance you were to get into a situation where there was a dispute, remember the difference between mediation and arbitration is mostly identified through monetary. In most cases, mediation is a discussion of terms and conditions. Arbitration is mostly revolving around compensation, who's to be paid and how. This is a compensation agreement, so arbitration needs to be offered. Can arbitration or can the dispute over funds be resolved through mediation? Yes, it can be. However, if mediation is not effective, thank you, then arbitration would be the only other option. If the seller chooses not to initial here, or the brokerage and the seller choose not to initial arbitration at the onset of the agreement to pay, and there becomes a dispute, then you would be able to modify this through the modification or an agreement between buyer and seller to move to arbitration.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you, appreciate it.
And that modification form is what follows. It's basically fill in the blanks and check the boxes. So if something were to change, again, this would be a seller countering whatever you provided as part of the offer. If you didn't have the discussion, or if the listing agent wasn't available to discuss what the seller's intentions are, you can modify that. This can be modified here, and it would be accepted. The other agreement is between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. So this relates to the discussion that would occur at the time of listing when the seller agrees that the compensation we have identified as the listing brokerage is fair, and that's been negotiated to the seller and brokerage's satisfaction. And then the next paragraph or next statement is, are you willing to provide, and again, this is me speaking English, not legalese, Are you, Mr. and Ms. Seller, Mr. Seller, going to provide compensation to a buyer's brokerage? Yes, no, maybe so. At what level? Yes, no, maybe so. This would be something that you could fill out at the time of listing that memorializes what the seller's intentions are. Right? Why did I put this in the purchase packages then also? Because you can identify to the selling brokerage, the listing brokerage, after a discussion with the listing agent, if the compensation is flowing through the brokerage. In other words, the listing agreement has already identified that the seller will be paying the listing brokerage first, then this would memorialize the compensation that must go between the listing brokerage and the selling brokerage, or the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. This would memorialize the situation that occurs currently through compensation being in MLS.
So if we have a signed listing agreement for 6%, that was signed before these changes.
6 bananas, okay, great.
6 bananas, yeah, I guess, right? And they say, you know, Maggie, we just trust you, we want you to get us our number, we want to reach our number, and want you to put the deal together and then present it to us. So knowing that they're not obligated to pay anything, and I already know what their end goal is, right? Because I don't take on a listing without knowing what their current mortgage, what they have to pay or whatever, right? Could it be up to me? Say, these are your options of what you could pay them, A or B?
Mm-hmm.
Could it be no, it can't be up to you. Can you counsel? Absolutely. The decision of whatever goes into the paragraph that states, I am the seller and I'm willing to pay a buyer's brokerage that's in the listing agreement, has to be the decision of the seller. So through your counsel, you could say commissions can be anywhere from 0 to 100%.
Ooh,
Ooh.
Me too. You know, obviously that's an extreme, but you know, could range from here to here, right? What would you like to do? Well, you're the listing agent. Tell me, you, Maggie, are the listing agent. Tell me what you think is fair. Well, you know, Maggie might say, I
If you
think
want to
that
sell if you want to sell your house and sell it quickly, then the best way is to offer compensation.
And the industry standard is 2.5% to 3.
No.
3%.
No.
Oh,
You
oh,
You can't use that.
No.
verbiage.
no standard,
got it, switch brokerages, guys.
no standards. We can't.
No, okay.
Yeah,
There is
we
no
just have,
standard.
Got it.
right. So, and you guys, please know that whenever we have these discussions, I'm not attacking and I'm not saying, you know, what I want to do is make sure that we're prepared, because I will tell you that over the next 6 to 9 months after August 17th, there will be testers. There will be calling.
Yeah.
They will be asking questions. They will be trying to trip you up.
Can we
Yeah.
spam those guys?
We can spam them all we want. Yeah.
I think this gets back to people that are really savvy, like the last people that just bought my house, he's an accountant. And he was questioning me about all this stuff. And this is stuff moving forward. But I can see them saying, you know what? I'm gonna let it ride, Mike. Let's just see what offers come in. And if someone asks, I will. But right now, I don't want to say, I don't want to give anything away. Let's see what the offers are and we'll negotiate it when the offer comes in and look at it as a whole.
Okay, I think it's a great example. We have to be prepared for that
Yeah.
comment. So, Mr. and Ms. Seller, you know, Mike, great as a seller then. I completely appreciate that.
Mhm.
Let me ask you, do you think that a buyer will bring an offer? Or do you think it would take longer for a buyer to bring an offer, knowing that there's no compensation?
My house looks pretty good, Clark. I feel pretty confident. I think they're gonna be able to want my house pretty quick. But I might consider it later, but I don't want to do it right now.
So then let's talk about pricing.
There you go.
Mm,
So now that we've established the playing field, Let's talk about pricing. I've given you a range. Where do you think you want to be in that range?
Ooh, excellent point. I want to move the house fairly quickly, but if I price it too low on your range, they may be asking more for the brokerage commission, so I may want to have to boost it up a little bit.
Okay, but now if you're going at the high end and we are deterring people from coming because they feel like, okay, now I've got to pay this price, plus I'm also paying compensation. What do you think the traffic's going to be like, Bob?
We're going to be a little weak.
Okay,
And there's
As-
none right now.
and
anyway.
as long, right, and yeah,
There's nothing happening.
and now you're talking about decreased traffic in a time when we have decreased activity.
So Clark,
And
how
greater
would you- How
compensation.
would you share what percentage I'm going to pay with you to those people?
It would have to
Can you
be
put it in MLS for me?
absolutely not. I can't, but what I can do is to meet your needs of wanting to give them that, of wanting to have flexibility. We can establish a discussion that can occur with the listing brokerage. We don't know what the buyer's brokerage agreement is, but we can help a buyer want your home. So if we establish that you'll offer a buyer's brokerage 2%, we can start that discussion. But I will tell you, rather than wait to see if a buyer is going to offer compensation, let's start someplace and get them to bring an offer with what they want as compensation. And then we can negotiate that compensation as part of an agreement to get your house sold.
So Clark, that
Beautiful.
sounds great. So I would like to be a part of that conversation and
Absolutely.
be on the call with you with the other buyer's brokerage. Is that
Only
fine?
if you're on mute.
No, but I can see where they're saying,
Okay.
I want to be on the call
Okay.
with the buyer's
Yeah.
brokerage as well.
And absolutely, what I'm going to recommend is that let me grab the information, bring you the information, and then engage you at that time.
At
Be-
that time or after the call?
Well, if we feel that it's necessary,
Okay.
then let's engage you in the call. But if I can gather the information and bring it to you, I'm going to decrease the amount of time that I'm trying to get to you to get you on the call.
Okay.
Rather than slow the process down, let me do my job. Let me bring the information to you. And if we feel it's necessary to get you on the call, then let's get you on the call at that time.
Okay, very good.
Is that fair?
Cause
Let
if
me
you're
do my job.
satisfied, then maybe just move.
That's a
forward.
good scenario.
I liked how you painted what it was going to be like. Like,
If you want to
told
bring,
him, yeah,
bring buyers in, let's start like this
Mhm.
and see if you want to be willing to do it. If you want to sell your house, this could be the best way to do it.
Right. There's a real estate trainer who's been around for 100 years. His name is David Knox. And I think his statement comes even more applicable now. Mike, do you want to stay or do you want to go? We really have to decide that. If you want to stay, then we may not even need to have this discussion. But if you wanted to go, then we need to figure out how to make this happen. And one, I don't believe offering no compensation is going to do that.
Right.
I think if we offer some compensation, we can at least generate interest and then make a decision on how we negotiate from that.
Yep.
Clark, are people going to use the word motivated sellers?
I'm sorry, Bonnie, motivated
Okay.
sellers?
Motivated sellers is what I can foresee them using to tell you that there is a compensation.
Yeah, yeah, motivated sellers, good, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
So, question to you, if this is coming and this is gonna be law, or our law in August, should we now start with this on our next presentations?
Yes.
I think we need to start now, that's why we're putting the forms in there now.
Right.
One, we're putting the forms in there now because of the sunsetting of NEFAR, but the other thing is that we've had the buyer agency agreement for almost 6 months as part of the checklist, in app files to encourage you to start. And many of you have already been getting those, which I greatly appreciate. But the more that we can get you acclimated to these processes, I think the stronger that you'll be out there.
Well, I'm more of a lister than a buyer's agent,
Right.
so this, I've got some coming up.
Good.
But I love what Mike said, that there are other people out there just saying, I sell it.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is a big key in the conversations because I work a little bit more long-term. I'm more of a relationship with my people. So the people that I'm working with now are looking to buy in December or next year. I've already planned that. So for me, this, I've already shared this to be on the lookout, especially the 2 listings appointment I've already had.
Right, that's,
They were already talked to people, and I'm like, you're not getting the full story. Let me tell you the other side of how this whole piece works.
That's
and they're
important.
gonna be so confused.
Right, and some people know, some people don't, but if we lay the groundwork and do the differentiation, okay. So one of the main, let me just jump back into the compensation agreements, the second compensation agreement, which is the seller's broker to the buyer's broker. This does have the parties being the sellers, the 2 brokerages, as would be the current situation. And then the property address, here's the optional field. It can be specific to an individual. So this seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage agreement would be for a specific individual.
So
I'll
it's a $1
check,
million buyer.
I'll check the call record and call him back. Okay, so that is the main difference in these two, and the fact that this is between the 2 brokerages. So at the onset of your listing, if you've done like Mike and talked to the seller and said, I understand, Ms. Seller, that they're telling you they're going to charge you 2.5%, they haven't talked to you about the buyer. What about the buyer? Well, you need to be prepared, because in most cases, the buyer is going to come asking you for something. So I need to prepare you for that. If you decide that up front, here's the buyer brokerage agreement, broker to broker, you could create this at the time of listing.
But it's
That's why
only
it's
for
in.
one property.
It's for the property that you've listed. Remember, this is
Oh,
buyer's broker to
Yeah, yeah,
seller's
yeah, yeah,
broker,
yeah, for that property.
seller's broker to buyer's broker.
Okay.
So this sets up a situation that we currently have. This takes the place of
MLS.
MLS disclosing compensation.
So
Hopefully
if,
everybody would like that.
so if we have somebody who does not want to go on MLS, does not want to do a waiver of entry, but wants us to sell their home for them, we would need these. And anything else?
Mm.
Like,
Well, if let's back up. So you're telling me we have no listing agreement?
Yeah, you gotta have a listing agreement first.
I like workarounds, yeah, but say they don't, like, yes, they've signed that, like, okay, I wanna be, I had this, I was messing with these compensation agreements to try to represent buyers and sellers, like, it's all muddled, at least in my neighborhood, where it's all crossing over, but if somebody wants to sell their home, they don't wanna list it on MLS, offered the waiver of entry, offered, whatever. But they still are like, come on, find me someone. Come on,
So
I need to
they're
do it."
not a listing. They don't have I own a house and I've come to you and say, look, I want you to find me a buyer. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you've said,
everybody like, oh yeah, what do you think of this house that I'll move into after? I'm like, you still haven't signed the listing agreement.
so. I mean, there are a couple of options. You can use the commission agreement to state, hey, Mr. Ms. Seller, whomever you are, if I bring you a buyer, here's what you're going to pay me. And you're only on one side of the transaction. You can do a one-time listing where you list it, and then that's called I think that's called the commission agreement, or there's the seller to buyer's broker would be a for sale by owner. The seller's broker to buyer's broker would be if you have a valid listing.
If there's a valid listing, got it.
Correct.
So like I got business that I sell, right? So I go to Biz Buy Sell or CoStar or whatever.
Sorry, wait. You have businesses you sell, not a business that you sell. You mean a commercial property.
A business, not the property. The
Okay,
business itself.
we need to take that away from
Like
here.
I saw Players Grill.
Right, but we need to take that away from here. First of all of these
But there's a
apply.
compensation agreement.
No, well, it's different though, because technically, so we have to have a conversation about businesses away from here, because technically, with your license, you aren't allowed to sell businesses. With a real estate license, that doesn't open you up to selling businesses. So we have to talk about that. Second, I know. So second, these rules and guidelines apply to residential. They don't apply to commercial.
Yeah.
So with commercial, remember, commercial offers dual agency. So. Alright,
This is residential real property, not commercial.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Now, that's not to say that the buyer's agency agreement can't apply to commercial. If you're working with a buyer
Yeah.
to ensure ensure compensation, I don't think it's a bad thing to get a buyer brokerage compensation agreement signed. And then your letter of intent would reflect what your buyer agency agreement states.
Right.
Yeah.
Out of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
This is a lot. This is a lot.
I know it's a lot. You're right. It's a lot.
Good friendly banter.
Yeah.
Well,
So
this is great.
so the main difference here is that two differences. The second agreement, the compensation agreement, is between brokerage to brokerage, which is what we've seen in MLS currently. This is when the seller agrees that compensation to the buyer's brokerage is valid and compensation to the compensation to the listing brokerage is agreed upon, and the seller has agreed to buyer brokerage compensation.
Mhm.
That's this second agreement here. And they can fill this out at the time of listing. That's why it's in your listing package. Or if during the discussion of working with a buyer, you've contacted the listing agent and the listing agent says, yes, the seller has already agreed to pay 2%, 3%, 17%, then this agreement is available for you to attach to an offer, committing the buyer's brokerage, committing the listing brokerage to pay the buyer's brokerage at the time of closing.
Is
Now,
this something that we can put in documents in MLS?
I'm sorry, Brett, repeat that, please.
Is this something that we can put in the documents tab
No.
in MLS or no MLS at all?
None of these compensation agreements can be in MLS.
Okay.
No compensation agreements or reference to compensation agreements or reference to compensation commission or any of those kinds of terms can appear in MLS, in documents or private remarks or public remarks.
$1,000 gone.
$1,000 gone. 1 second. Let's go over.
So say I'm working with a new buyer, they're like, I wanna see that house, we'll say it's like September. The only way that I will know what that seller is going to be offering commission is by if the agent answers me
Correct.
and is honest.
Bingo.
Then we can get it in writing.
That's
So
when you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can't you
Well, I
request
wouldn't
that in
call
writing,
it
say, hey, I've got someone that's interested in looking at the property, I want to confirm what the commission is that you would be paying
Well,
from the seller
I
side.
don't think you can do this.
You can't do that. The only way you could do that would be to submit a seller to buyer brokerage agreement unless the seller has already agreed to pay the listing brokerage. Then you would have the second agreement, which of course the seller also has to execute.
So we can only take them at their word then unless
Email. Hello?
Clark, we lost your voice.
Clark, you disappeared.
Oh, I think Clark must have been disconnected.
Yeah, I just texted him to see if we can get him back to let him know. I'm also
Okay.
gonna send a message through the Zoom message
Okay.
board.
So when we are showing properties, we honestly don't have the slightest idea when we begin showing property A, B, and C or what the compensation is going to be. Is
Correct.
that? Oh, Lord.
I think that the best way to approach it is to assume that the seller is offering no compensation. And that you have your buyer's broker agreement and that all compensation is going to be negotiated with the offer, not the listing agreement at all.
Correct. That-
So
I feel sorry for the first time home buyers. So not only, because what's going to happen is these sellers are going to still want the maximum what the house next door sold. So they're not going to agree to lower the price. And now you're going to have these first time home buyers. Not only are they paying these elevated prices, but they're going to be asked to pay 2.5%, 3% more.
well, here's the way that I'm going to approach it, and I'm just going to assume that every seller has got zero compensation, because because if I make any assumptions about what they're offering or anything like that, all of a sudden I could be in legal trouble,
Right.
and I don't want that. So I'm going to assume everybody is at a zero.
Right.
And then we're going to negotiate that based on what my buyer broker agreement is. For example, if my buyer broker agreement is at 2.5 or 3% or whatever amount, 55 bananas, I'm going to assume that I'm going to ask for that as part of the closing costs. So if they have 4% for closing costs and 3% for my commission, I'm going to ask for 7% compensation. And then include the form saying that 3% of that is my compensation.
I'm still.
Your video is.
Right, I'm
Agree.
not. We're back, so we're hearing you, and it's a good discussion.
Okay, good.
And it's still being recorded. So thank you, Bonnie and Leanne, for sending me a message. Gina also. We got dropped off and we're back now. So
Can I ask a quick question?
yeah, of course.
Okay, so do you think this is gonna change how like appointments are made? Like if I have a listing agreement, an agent's gonna call and say, I, wanna schedule an appointment, but do you have a seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement? Is that a question that's allowed to be asked?
Yeah, you can ask that over the phone. There can be no disclosure within showing time or any other or MLS related to compensation or an agreement to pay a buyer's
Right.
brokerage.
Right,
A
but that is
buyer.
a question they can ask when, I see it changing how instead of necessarily using showing time as much, I can see agents calling more and finding that out before they show it. But are you allowed to disclose at that point? Say I'm the listing agent and an agent calls me and says, do you have a compensation agreement, seller's broker to buyer's brokerage? Yes, you do. Great. What is it? And they ask me that and I disclose it.
Yes.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
That's the purpose for the call. Absolutely.
Okay,
And then
that's
you
what-
would follow that up with either. I'm sorry,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
I'm sorry, I lost you. I'm trying, what did you say? I'm sorry.
No, I said you're exactly right. You pegged the exact conversation that we're going to have with listing agents. And then we want to follow that up either when we make the offer with one of these two compensation agreements based on what the listing agent tells us. Yes, the seller has agreed to pay the buyer's brokerage, or yes, the seller is compensating the listing brokerage and we will compensate the buyer's brokerage. So whichever, so if you're the listing agent and I call you and you say to me, yes, the seller is willing to compensate the buyer's brokerage 2.5%, and I say, great, thank you very much. Then I can either memorialize that by using this, one of the seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement,
Right.
and send it to you to affirm that, or I can send it with an offer.
Okay, and are they allowed to and are they allowed, are agents allowed to ask then at time of scheduling appointment, okay, can you send me that compensation agreement? Can I see it? Or are we just taking people at their word when they say yes, or they're offering X percentage?
Well, I mean,
I know that,
we'll have to take it. Yeah, we'll have to take them for their word when we have the conversation. I think
Okay.
it's always a very positive thing to follow it up with an email. And then
Right.
if you submit an offer, use the compensation agreement, depending on how the compensation is to flow, or follow the conversation up with one of the compensation agreements prior to at the time of showing.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So would this
Yeah,
be
of
something
course.
that we could disclose in our personal marketing of the property, like on Facebook and Instagram and those kinds of things? And is this something that we could leave the document in the house for a buyer to see when they're coming through to tour? If we're not allowed to put it in the
Yes.
MLS, how are we getting that information disseminated?
So if you aren't making the phone calls, so the phone calls is one way to disseminate the information. Other way is that you can market, your personal marketing can identify that the seller is willing to compensate either the buyer's brokerage or the listing brokerage is compensating the buyer's brokerage. You can do that in your flyers. It can go onto your own personal website. It cannot be disseminated through
MLS.
distribution to other websites or through IDX.
Right. So,
Not bad, so you could put it in your brochures in the house.
Yes, you
Or you
can.
can,
Wow.
do your open houses or whatever, however you want to do it.
Correct.
What about print, like the resident, or something like that?
Yes.
Owns the land,
Yes.
just put it in.
Yes.
You're gonna advertise.
So you can advertise that a seller is well. I mean, I would probably not be specific. I would probably say seller is offering buyer brokerage compensation.
So
Yeah.
because that could still be searchable.
You can't put that in MLS portion.
No, not in MLS, not in
You
showing.
can't go out by index. So it can't go out to the-
Clark, is there any point, I understand here that this is buyer's broker or broker or authorized associate. Is there any point that when you or Audrey would have to sign this and not us?
No, you can initial it on our behalf. Once the policies are set, you'll just know what the impact is to you if there's any impact at all.
Okay, I'm just kind of curious why that was on there, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay,
But would you prefer us to have you look at it or sign it?
We don't want to delay anything.
Okay.
I mean, as long as like we do now,
Mhm.
and everybody knows what what the company dollar is based on, and you know the difference, and if you make a decision off of that, then you know the ramifications. That's the same way that we'll establish the policies for the company related to this.
so if the seller is paying this and we go to closing, is he then allowed to give me a personal check to give to you?
Yeah, one time.
If the seller is paying this and he doesn't roll it into the mortgage, and he says, okay, I'm responsible now, I owe you $11,000. I go to closing, it's not part of this. I now hand you a check, Clark, personal check. Is that the way this is going to happen?
No,
Or can it be that way?
well, you said seller and mortgage. So
That's-
if there's some that's coming from the buyer, well, I would believe that both parties would want it on the closing disclosure because, of course, there are tax ramifications. So I would believe they would both want it on a closing disclosure.
What
If
they
a
don't?
seller wants to pay it, that's
That's
fine.
$11,000. If he's willing to say, it, can we accept that then?
We probably would not accept a personal check for $11,000.
So,
I don't
okay.
I don't know.
No, I'm just questioning it because if it's coming directly from the seller, I can see that as being a big tax advantage for me then. But, okay.
Well, no, because it would still be recorded
Price.
payment to us and then payment to you. I mean, so
how would that be
It
put
would
on the
be-
closing statement?
compensation,
Compensation,
yeah, compensation, buyer brokerage, Legends of Real Estate,
gotcha.
brokerage B, or Legends of Real Estate. We like those.
I'm just trying to figure out if the title company would still have to cut a check or if they could bypass that.
No,
I'm
that-
sorry, title company would cut a check to who? Us?
The agents like they normally do,
Mhm.
or if the individual seller could do that then directly.
Well, the individual seller or the buyer, whoever's paying whatever portion of the compensation, if they want to cut a check straight to the brokerage, they have the right to do that. There's nothing in here that states that it has to be on the closing disclosure. It just states that it has to be paid at closing.
Yeah, but that's my question. So if they hand me a personal check and you say, Mike, hey, we don't accept a personal check, do we need to say, hey, it has to be a cashier's check or?
If we establish those guidelines, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I sincerely doubt, I can't think of a reason why, I can't think of a reason why a buyer or seller would want to pay it outside of closing.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just questioning.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Somebody will. I mean, you
I
never know.
suppose,
Little Venmo action.
well, sure,
Wire the
but there's a
funds to the
limit.
title agency.
Wire the monies to the title agency, sure, yeah. Or, I mean, I guess it's the easiest out of proceeds, or if a buyer is paying a portion of it. For example, if you've agreed to 3% and the seller's paying 2% and the buyer's paying 1%, and you haven't waived the differential.
It's all
So-
gonna be.
Fun games.
So, you had a question, and I.
No, it was
I
answered.
got the inward on, where do you, have
All right.
somebody?
So everybody
Not at that-
online, is there anything else you want to bring up? I thank you for your discussion there when we got dropped off.
G Suite.
Oh.
I like the assume zero and everybody knows what their responsibilities are.
No, but. it's definitely- it's been-
I'm sorry, Bonnie, go ahead.
No, I'm fine.
You're fine. Jill, we good?
We're good. I'm wrapping my head around all of it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Welcome, welcome. I think we all are. All right, for those online, thank you for being here and taking the time. For those here, great to see your faces and thanks for being here.
Thank you, thank you.
We'll
Thank
keep
you.
doing these scripts and try to keep things up.
Yes.
Please note, I don't know what day of the week July 9th is, but know that the Tuesday after that, the topic will definitely be the revisions to the buyer's agency agreement and any other agreements that come up there. Next week, I believe we're doing the listing agreement again. I can't remember, but watch app files for anything. Please, as a final item in our recording, this was recorded, it will be put up to the YouTube channel. All discussions that take place here are for members of the Legends of Real Estate. So thank you very much.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you,
Appreciate
Bob.
your time.
Thank you.
Energy,
Thank
and
you.
effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
If we missed anything, please don't hesitate to email me, text me, or call me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Clark.